demonstrate a simple way to cook dry beans from scratch. You could certainly use prepared beans, such as canned beans, opting ideally for the low sodium or no salt added varieties where you would rinse and drain them before making the recipes that we include in the course. So here though, I'll show you how to make dry beans. They're just very, very economical. It's easy to make, very large batches, small batches. You can freeze them ahead. You can make them in soups and stews. There's endless ways that you could meal prep these. Sticking with the theme of not having a lot of specialized equipment to do this at home, if we just have a container to soak beans in, if you want to pre-soak, a pot with a lid, water, and your beans, you're all set. You have everything that you need. So I have some black beans here, and I don't give exact times for cooking any of the beans because depending on how big or small your beans are, depending on how long they've been sitting on the shelf, how dry they are, they can take pretty varying amounts of time to cook. But I will give you some tips to have a successful outcome with cooking them. So the fastest way to cook them is to pre-soak them. So I have dry beans here that are just out of the package. And then here I have the same 2 cups of beans that have been soaked overnight. You can see that it just is a cloudy, dark colored liquid, but I promise they're in the bottom. So when you put beans in a container to soak, you want to fill the water up at least a few inches above the top of the level of the beans. They expand greatly. I'll just kind of reach in here and pull a few out. And you can see that the size of the beans is pretty different, right? There's the little dry ones here, and then they're at least twice as big, soaked overnight. I just left these out on the counter to soak, but if you wanted to prepare ahead of time, you could soak them in the fridge for a few days if you wanted to. That timing isn't really that sensitive. If you forget to soak them overnight and you still want to have a nice even cooking that generally affords, then you can do what we call a quick soak method. So you can just put the beans with water a couple of inches to cover in a pot and bring it to a rolling boil and then turn it off, cover it, and let it sit for 2 hours, and then drain off that liquid and proceed as if you had soaked them overnight. And then other people just swear by not soaking at all and just putting the beans in the pot with more water than you would use if you had soaked them overnight, because you'll have the cooking expansion and the soaking expansion all together in the pan, and that just takes longer to cook. You'll be using more energy to cook that way, but it doesn't require that forethought of soaking ahead of time. Some people like to use pressure cookers like Instant Pots or just old standard pressure cookers, and in that case you would just follow the instructions that came with your device. And one note about slow cookers. So some people will cook beans in slow cookers. You have to be careful with kidney beans in particular. I would not recommend cooking kidney beans in a slow cooker. There's a toxic compound in there called phytohemagglutinin that requires 15 minutes of boiling, like at a rolling boil, to eliminate that, so to make it safe to eat. Slow cookers don't usually get to that high of a temperature, and so there's always, I always hear of at least one case a year where someone slow cooked their beans and then took a big dish to a potluck and poisoned people with it. They usually recover, but it's, people are very uncomfortable and can get quite sick from that. So don't cook kidney beans in a slow cooker, and if it's, a lot to remember, that just maybe avoid the slow cooker and just cook it in a pot on the stove or a pressure cooker. A pressure cooker is always going to get up to the temperature that you're going to need to make the beans safe to eat. So I'm going to go and drain these beans that have soaked overnight, and then I'll show you the beginning of cooking them in the pot. And I'm going to add them to this pot. And this was the 2 cups that we had that's now expanded to about 1 quart of volume so far. Now I just want to cover with water by a couple of inches. If you haven't done this before, it feels like a lot of water, but the beans really absorb a lot and they boil for a significant amount of time, so you'll also have some evaporation that occurs. Just to speed up the boiling process, I'll cover the pot, but you do want to keep a close eye on it because it can certainly go from not boiling to boiling over quickly. While we wait for that to happen, I just want to mention a couple of other things. So salting or using other liquids, you want to avoid using a pre-salted stock here if you want to cook your beans in stock or add aromatics like, throw in a carrot or celery or half of an onion, some herbs. That would be perfectly fine, but avoid adding salt at this stage. Salt will slow the cooking and it can really take quite a bit longer. If you want to add salt, which does really help to enhance the flavor of the beans, really bring the flavor to your palate, then I typically wait until the beans are completely tender and done cooking, and then add in the amount that I would want at the end, and then just bring it up to a rolling boil again for about 5 minutes. That will be enough to help that salt to start to penetrate the skin of the beans and start to season into the inner part of the beans. And then once that 5 minutes is up, I'll turn it off and allow the beans to cool. The beans will continue to soak up liquid and soak up flavors from liquid as it sits in the as they sit in the liquid. And so if you say made a soup with beans and you kept all that broth and seasoned it to taste one day and then it sat in the fridge overnight or until the next day, then you actually might realize that if you go to taste it again, you have to add a little bit more because it will taste less salty because those beans continue to absorb that seasoning. The other thing that you want to wait to add to beans is anything acidic. That will also slow down the cooking. So you don't want to add any tomato products, diced tomatoes, tomato sauce, things like that. Are very acidic and they will slow the cooking. You don't want to add any vinegars, things like Tabasco sauce includes vinegar, other chili pepper sauces add vinegar, lemon juice, just avoid all of that to seasoning to the end. So our beans have come to a boil, and at this point I leave them uncovered because if you're keeping it at a boil, there's just a good chance it's going to boil over at some point if you leave the lid on. So I'll turn it down just to make sure that it's anywhere between a simmer and a boil. And for these type of black beans or really any beans a similar size, I'll come back and check them in about 30 minutes, but typically it's going to take a fair amount longer, probably closer to 45 or 60 minutes. If you have beans that have been sitting on your shelf for years, it might take longer than that. Larger beans are going to take longer, and things like lentils that are really small are going to be much more quick cooking, maybe even in 10 or 15 minutes. So it's good to look up the exact type of bean or lentil that you're going to make and get an estimate of the cooking time. I usually start checking about halfway through that cooking time, knowing that it's going to take a lot longer. But sometimes you have a fresher bean, especially if you mail order from an heirloom bean company, something to that effect, and it might cook in half as much time as some of the dried beans that have been sitting on the shelf for a while at the grocery store. So if you start to get this foam on top, the other thing that I would recommend doing is, and this is more important if you're making a soup or something where you're going to have all that broth, but you can skim it off. This is a really small amount, but sometimes it will be, a big thick, an inch of frothy foam on top. And it's just not a very pleasant taste or texture. So I just skim that off. I might do that a few times during cooking. Not essential, but just, one tip. We'll come back to this in about 30 minutes and check taste for doneness. I did check them, as I mentioned, about halfway through the estimated cooking time. I checked them after about 30 minutes, and they definitely weren't done. Our black beans are here. They've been boiling now about 60 minutes, and let me just show you how I check them. So there's quite a few beans here. You can see that some of them are broken in half, some of the skins are starting to split, and some of them are whole. That's usually, you usually have a mix between those when your whole pot of beans is done. They're only done when the least cooked ones are done because it's really unpleasant to get a hard bean in there. So let me just pull one of these whole ones off here and just taste it. And so what I'm tasting for is both taste and texture. So I'm looking for a creamy texture, no grittiness, no sandiness, no hard bits. And I think we're there. So the least cooked bean there was done. And at this point, if you want to season with salt, which I like to do, but if you're avoiding adding extra salt, you certainly don't need to. So I'm going to put, about a teaspoon or so for this, this pot. And I just want to stir it, keep it at a rolling boil for about 5 minutes, and then pull it off the heat. A couple of other things that I want to mention about bean cooking is that if you're doing the smaller amount, you pull it off the heat, cool it to about room temperature, and put it in the fridge, you're probably safe. But let's say you're making, pounds of beans, a big stock pot of bean soup, then it's going to take much longer than would be safe to cool it, so much more time. So for example, if you just took a stock pot with a couple gallons of soup in it, put it in the fridge, it might be many hours or even, early the next day where it's actually cooled to a safe temperature, which is less than 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So, in restaurants, we actually have these big ice things that will stick in the middle of a soup. But what you can do at home, since you might not have those specialized things to cool off a big pot of soup, is just separate it into smaller amounts. So, maybe 2 cup, which would be a bowl of soup, or quart size, which is a couple bowls of soup, and cool it that way in the fridge. Even if you're going to freeze it, you might want to cool it off to room temperature or get it so it's not going to melt any containers you might put this in, and then put it in those smaller containers in the fridge or freezer. And if you want to make it easy to use the beans in a recipe, then what you can do is each can of beans, and a lot of times I've noticed recipes will give beans in amounts of cans. So if you have a 14.5 or 15 ounce can of beans, that's 1.5 cups of cooked beans. So I will often, once this cools off enough to handle, measure out 1.5 cup amounts and put them in small containers or baggies, freeze them that way, so that when I go to use a recipe that needs 1 can of beans, I just take out 1 container from the freezer. And if I'm putting it into something that has a sauce or will boil, then there's no need to defrost ahead of time. If it's something I do need to defrost it for, then that small amount will defrost at room temperature in a safe way. If you have a really large container, then the outside ones are going to be, again, at an unsafe food temperature far before the inner ones get unfrozen. So another reason to freeze or store things in smaller amounts is food safety. So it's been 5 minutes. We've been boiling our beans with that little bit of salt, so now we can consider this done. I would turn off the heat, and then we'll go ahead and package it up as I've described and use it in any recipe or dish. If you want to see what they look like, I can just pull a few out here. So here we have our beans, and again, a mixture of whole beans and ones that are, slightly starting to break apart, and that's usually when they're done.